Tony J. Blevins is a former Vice President of Procurement at Apple, where he spent 22 years leading teams that brought products like the iPhone and Apple Watch to market. Before joining Apple, Blevins held key supply chain and engineering roles at IBM, working across multiple global locations. He currently serves on the boards of NextGen Cyber Talent, Pivotal Commware, and Urbanic. A Summa Cum Laude graduate from North Carolina State University, Blevins has earned numerous industry accolades, including the prestigious Captain of Industry Award in 2022. Our host, Helen Wang, met Tony at Apple, where they worked together on building a global supply chain. Keep listening to learn more about how Tony got the nickname Blevinator, how he mastered the art of negotiation, and his new perspective on the 25-second TikTok video that changed his life.
Hello everyone, I'm Helen Wang, the founder and CEO of Oceanside Perspective, a nonprofit educational platform. If you're new here, welcome to our community. And if you're already familiar with our content, welcome back. Life is like a book, and you are the author of your own story. Some chapters are sad, some are happy, and some are full of surprises. But you never know what the next chapter holds if you don't turn the page. Today, I'm excited to have Tony Blevins with us to share his incredible journey. Tony, thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much, Helen. It's my pleasure to be here.
Do you want to say hi to our audience and maybe do a brief introduction?
Hello. Yes, my name is Tony Blevins. So I worked at both IBM and Apple for a number of years, primarily in engineering and operations, and am now very happily retired in South Florida, loving life.
There are, people, events, and stories sort of shaped who we are. So is there a hero in your life, for example?
I think that's very true about what you suggest about shaping influences. And in my case, there's a very clear and obvious answer, and it's my father, who's been deceased now for almost 2 years, but not a day goes by that I don't think of him, that he was so inspirational to me. He was such a unique individual, and a little bit about him. He dropped out of high school when he was 16 years old and started working because he was very ambitious, enthusiastic, and began working at construction. And so, but his dream was to own his own business. And so he would work during the day, he would learn, and then he began building houses on his own as spec houses, and then would resell them. And so he started from that to building a multi-million-dollar enterprise called Blevins Construction, where he built entire neighborhoods. He built the hospital where I grew up. He built a number of Kmarts in the Southeast. And one thing about my father, he was always completely self-sufficient and self-taught, that he had an uncle who challenged him to rebuild a Ford flathead engine when he was 14 years old. And with only basic tools and no training or knowledge, he figured it out and built it. And that was indicative to the way that he did everything. And so, starting at the ground floor in construction, he went on to get his contractor's license, his electrician's license, his plumbing license, his landscape architecture, that he knew and did everything. And so he could construct anything from ground zero. And so therefore he knew how to hire people. He knew how to teach them, train them. But more than the career success, he taught me a lot about interpersonal things. He was a very spiritual man, that he was deacon of the family church, that I can recall him after working tremendously hard all week. He'd be up at 6 a.m. every Sunday because he would volunteer to teach Sunday school to children. And so he did everything in his life with just a great deal of passion and enthusiasm, and I've always admired that, and I've tried to emulate it to the degree I could.
Your dad sounds an amazing person, self-taught, an entrepreneur. If you were to summarize your father in a sentence, what would that be?
I would say he's probably the most ingenious man who conducted himself with the utmost integrity, is the way I think about it. That I've never met anyone who had anything bad to say about him.
What are some of the most value that he has shaped you?
He taught me the value of hard work, that there's no substitute for throwing yourself 100% into something. He also taught me how important it is to prepare to succeed, to have a positive attitude toward things, but to always give back and be empathetic to others. That he was quite a role model, not just for me, but for many.
Just so you know, my father is my hero too.
Mm.
So that resonated a lot with me. Everybody has different story, but I also lost him a few years ago. So
See, I'm sorry to hear
deeply
that.
miss him. Yeah.
On occasion, I've been asked, who you learned the most from. And that answer would surprise most people or seem a bit peculiar. That was very influential growing up. Someone who was always also very influential in my life, Dr. Miller, who was our Little League coach, who was just a phenomenal individual. He was the local neighborhood doctor that everybody went to. There wasn't another option. His passion was sports and coaching, and he would take, young men and develop them. And so to him, it was more about athletics. He was developing character. He was developing passion. And so in the school I went to, we had the ability to choose between one of two Little League teams. One would have about 15 players and you could play immediately, or the other was Dr. Miller's team. They would have about 130 or so tryout. Everybody wanted to play on his team because his team always won. And at that age, none of us thought, well, if I went to the other team, I could probably play. If I go to Dr. Miller's team, I'm going to have to be tutored and it'll be several years before I'm ever good enough to hit the field. And to give you an idea, that team only had about 25 uniforms. So the top 25 got uniforms. The next 25 got the uniforms that were used 15 years ago. The next 25, goodness knows what they were wearing. And then below that, you just wore jeans and a shirt that was the right color. But Dr. Miller's philosophy was that you had to learn by doing, not by being told. So he would take us out on the field and we just start playing, and he would start by teaching you to run the bases. And so when you made an error, you didn't do something correctly, he would stop and he would, no, that's not the way you do it. He didn't tell you how to do it. He'd let you try and say, no, that's right or that's wrong. And the special relationship that he and I had, that at one of the banquets, I was just a kid, he took me aside, he goes, I've never met anyone like Blevins who's as good at learning from other people's mistakes. I've never seen him make a mistake because he learns by seeing others do mistakes. And he goes, in life, it's always good to learn from your mistakes. It's much better to learn from the mistakes of others. And so I think that carried on with me, that through life and through business, as I see people make mistakes, I try to catalog. I don't want to do that. That's not how I want to be known. That's not how I behave. And so I have learned so much from the mistakes of others. At least I hope I have. And I've made some of my own, but I've learned a lot from the mistakes of others.
What about professionals? Like after you entered into the job market and then you started to become a professional, is there anyone that on top of your list who influenced you?
I'd have to say, way back in my days at IBM, their chief procurement officer, a gentleman by the name of Gene Richter, who was the first person to ever achieve that title, and it just didn't exist before him. He was so talented and so influential. I'm going to try to not name too many people by name during this discussion, just out of respect. But in this case, I would have to say Gene. He was quite amazing.
You're actually not the first one that I heard mentioning his name.
Mm.
I never met with him, but people seems to have such a respect for him. And if you would name a few things or high quality or something you admire about him, what would that be?
He was a man with a vision, and he worked so hard on preparation. And I think that's what made him so good at what he did. And bear in mind, I think he did procurement as a profession for close to 50 years. He knew what he was doing and he was very good at it. And every day he would continue to refine his skills. He continued to read, he continued to write. And so every day he was building, but more importantly, he really took the time to teach and mentor others, which is what he did with me. And I'm forever grateful that in terms of procurement profession, I'm sure he taught me more than anybody else.
Let's talk about your early life. You're known for your passion for cars. When did you have your first car?
It's an interesting question, something I haven't thought about for a long time, but my father, after running the construction business, he retired, but because he was a lifelong car enthusiast, the first thing he did was go out and buy a car, and then one thing led to another, and then he wound up running an auto dealership for about 25 years. And so it was about time for my 16th birthday, and he got a car into inventory that I absolutely lusted after. I wanted that car so bad, I couldn't stand it. It was a 1975 Triumph TR6. And so that was considered very exotic in the mountains of North Carolina, where most people drove Fords and Chevys. And so I tried to impress upon my father how much I wanted that car, and I thought it should be my first car. And he took me aside and was very pragmatic. And he said, Tony, we're not rich people, and that car is $3,000. So, and he told me that he would pay half for me a car if I would get something reasonable and reliable, like a Toyota or a Datsun, not a Triumph, British sports car. And of course, because I was 16 years old and I knew everything and didn't realize at the time, how much my father did know, I thought I'll just do it on my own. And so I found one of his colleagues who sold cars who had not a Triumph TR6, but a Triumph TR7 for $1,300 versus $3,000. And so I got a job working in the North Carolina tobacco fields that summer, up every day at 6 a.m. And so I was able to persuade that dealer to hold it for me with a $100 deposit. And so I worked every day in the tobacco fields for about 12 weeks and managed to eke out just over $1,300. And so I went and bought the car on my own. Now, as it turns out, a Triumph TR7 is one of the worst cars known to man, very different than a TR6. But at 16 years old, I didn't understand that, and I knew what I could afford. And so I drove it home, and my dad looked at me. He goes, "What's that Triumph TR7 doing there?" And I go, "I bought it." And he goes, "Why did you do that?" I slammed the keys on the table and I go, "Because I'm a man. That's why." And my father looked at me and goes, "Well, I hope you're also an auto mechanic, because you're going to need to be one. Those cars are nothing but buckets of bolts." And I thought, does he know? I'll drive this thing to high school and it's so exotic. No one there will be able to tell this $1,300 Triumph from a Lamborghini, which was very true. I mean, I got so many accolades the first day of driving that thing, and I drove it like 3 days until I had the first breakdown. And so I started learning how to fix cars, and I'm able to make it to that summer before the transmission comes out of it. And I was able to locate one, which had been a previous Triumph TR7 my dad had sold years back. The people gave up on fixing it and just junked it. And so I was able to get the transmission out. And so I began changing my first transmission at 16 years old. And so I'm up underneath the jack stands with very little knowledge. And my father let me struggle with it for about a week out in the sun. And he took me aside and he goes, "Tony, anybody as stubborn and arrogant as you are going to have skills to survive in life. That I don't think I'll ever change your personality, but you're going to have skills if you're going to get by." And so then he very patiently taught me how to do everything. And so I learned everything from cars from my dad. But I'll never forget many lessons learned there. One of which is that if you really want something, you go get it yourself. The second thing I did after that summer, I redoubled myself toward education. That after spending that summer in the North Carolina tobacco fields, I concluded this work is way too hard for me. I cannot do this the rest of my life, that I'm going to have to get the best education I possibly can. And then I thought to myself that I do have an inclination for just taking things on and thinking I can do anything. And so if you have that attitude, you're going to have some skills. My dad was right. And so I've always tried to develop my skills base instead of modifying my personality.
Very interesting story. I almost feel like a movie playing in front of me.
To go full circle now, it's been since 1983, so over 40 years later, I do actually own a Triumph TR6. I thought to myself, one day I will own one of those things. And as it turns out, now I do. And that one I think I paid about $12,000 for. And I didn't have to work in a tobacco field to get it. So sometimes things work out. So I do own one now.
Do you want to tell us a little bit about your hometown, where you come from?
It's a small place called Crumpler. And I tell people, because no one's ever heard of Crumpler, because we're not super well developed in the sense that we don't have a red light or a stoplight. We do have a post office or anything like that. But I tell them that Crumpler is just east of East Jefferson, which is east of Jefferson, which is east of West Jefferson, which is the county capital, and it's about 20,000 people. But it's in the Blue Ridge Mountains of North Carolina, terrifically beautiful place. probably one of the least affluent places in the United States, but everybody there is happy, friendly. That growing up, the house that my father built, we didn't even have any keys. That we would go on vacation for the summer. The house was never locked. I didn't need to carry them with me. The keys are always kept in the car. When I went to high school, there were lockers. We never could figure out why they called them that, because no one had a lock. That everybody knew one another, and there just was no theft. There was no crime. And so it was quite a wonderful place to grow up. And I only learned that once I went to college at NC State. I went to Raleigh, and because I had that type of attitude and no fear, the very first day I was in Raleigh, my wallet was stolen because I was so careless with it, and all $60 that I had to my name at that point was gone. But I learned something that I didn't really appreciate where I came from as much as I should have until that happened. And I sometimes tell people that I think in life in general, one cannot truly experience sweetness unless you know what sour is. And so you really don't understand what it is. And so several things, I'll have something that circumstances that might not be great. And I think, well, that's doing nothing more than teaching me how good it was or how good it could be. But you need that to balance things out.
So from your hometown, is there a lot of people go to university?
No, it's very rare, very unusual. In fact, in high school, I was known as somewhat of the class clown, and some of the teachers told me when they found out my aspiration was to go to NC State, they go, "You'll never make it there. That's a tough school. That your attitude is not going to work." And so the only reason I went, my father was skeptical too, that I wound up getting a full ride academic scholarship. That I've always been good at standardized tests for whatever reason. So I got a full ride scholarship to NC State. And based on everything they told me, I began to believe them. I'm like, maybe I'm going to get flunked out after the first semester. And so I go that one semester, I come back, and I'm waiting anxiously for the first report card, which at that time would come in the mail, and you'd peel it open. It was on the perforated paper. I'll never forget, I was sitting in the garage with my father, who was somewhat incredulous about going to formal school anyway. And he goes, "What did you get?" And so I told him I got a 3.8. And he goes, "Well, what's it supposed to be?" And we go round and round, because he was trying to get to, I'm like, well, theoretically, it could be a 4.0. And he goes, "That's what I thought. That's what I was getting at." He says, "Why are you going to school if you're not even trying and you're goofing off? That we didn't send you to Raleigh to goof off." And my dad was quite a taskmaster. And he goes, "We don't ever expect to see that again, do we?" I'm like, "No, sir, we don't." And so every report I had after that was a 4.0. That he made it clear to me that was unacceptable to his standards.
Were you the first generation college students in your family?
Yes.
What does that mean to you and to your family?
I guess I chose a different path. And, one bit of insight I don't mind sharing with you is a person, my grandmother, my father's mother, was one of the most influential people in my life. And in retrospect, I should have mentioned her as well. That she lived in North Carolina, and all she ever did was take care of family. And she loved family. That she babysat everyone. That was just her lifelong passion. That she lived to be 102 years old without ever leaving the county. Never had a driver's license, never left the county. To her, what was important was right in front of her. And with every grandchild, because I've since talked to later, the thing she impressed upon them more than anything else is, you stay right here with family. Your home is in Ashe County, and you should stay here. With me, she told me the opposite. She said, "Tony, you're different than the other grandchildren. And it breaks my heart, but I want you to go."
Wow. So
I
she
remember
must have seen
conversations I
something
never,
different. Yeah.
I never knew why.
It's interesting. You also mentioned earlier about maybe your teacher, nobody believed you would go to college. And you mentioned that attitude, like they think your attitude is not going to take it. So what exactly that was when you were like 16 years old, or what people see you in terms of attitude?
Oh, I was just fun, go lucky, happy. I pulled all sorts of pranks on everyone, including the teachers. That one came up with an idea. This is when cassette players just came out, and we didn't like the idea of sitting through some of the classes for an hour. And so I actually taped the ringing of the bell. And so we got into class before it started, and we moved the clock up about 50 minutes. And I had everyone briefed that I'm going to hit this exactly. And so it seemingly the bell went off. The teacher looked up the clock. The clock said it was time to go. All of us got up and left. And we went out and had a nice day out in the classroom. And I'll never forget that. The principal of the school happened to be making his rounds, and he saw about 30 of us sitting out on the lawn, having a good time, having sodas. And he walked straight over to me and goes, "Tony, what did you do?" But he did. But he saw that all of us were supposed to be in class and we weren't, and he knew I'd done something.
Yeah. Yeah, I see that part of you like to have fun, especially when you were that young age. I think
Yeah,
that's definitely part of your character. Yeah.
I still like to have fun. My objective is not to grow up. I want to continue having fun.
Yeah. So what were you major in college?
It was engineering with a minor in computer science.
Wow. Absolutely right now, very popular major, right? Both engineering and computer science. What about back then?
I think it was popular, but not to the same degree. But I've just always been fascinated by engineering and building things, and have loved it. And it's only later did I migrate into operations, which I also loved, and specifically the area of operations that I just felt had a fit for me in terms of passion was procurement. And the thing I liked about that more than anything else was the people aspects, the people that you associate with, you deal with. And I've always thought of procurement as being the intersection of art and science. The science part meaning your preparation, your attention to detail, being ready to discuss something in the most in greater depth, and then planning a strategy, executing it, but also being adaptable and flexible on your feet and listening. And so negotiation has just always been something that I love and do to this day.
All right, I can't wait. Let's begin talking about your professional career. Which company did you join? When was that? And what was your first job?
I joined IBM, and this is going to date me because I don't look this old, I'm assuming, 1989. And my first job was in cost engineering. And so I worked in cost engineering, industrial engineering, manufacturing engineering, product operations. I was actually did a number of different roles there over about 12 years. I worked in multiple divisions. I did international assignments in Tokyo, Seoul, 2 years in Glasgow, Scotland. That IBM had something called an executive resource program. And so I was named upon their executive resource program inbound. And so the idea was to get me as much exposure and experience in the shortest period of time possible to be groomed to be a senior executive one day. And so have a lot of great memories about that, that back when I joined in the late 1980s, IBM was still probably the most respected company on the planet. And so it was quite an honor to work there. And I felt really good about that. And they had exceptionally good training programs. There were so many people I worked with. I admired how they carried themselves. And it was a very different environment than what would eventually follow at Apple. That there, I wore a dark blue suit, pressed white shirt, wingtips every day. And one anecdote that makes me, think about that somewhat fondly. There was one Friday I came in and I gave a presentation that I thought went pretty well. And the third level manager, my manager's manager was there. This is the big boss. He brings me in. I sit down in his office and he looks at me and goes, two things. One is, great job today. I'm very impressed. I'm like, well, thank you. He goes, the second thing is, are you going to the circus today? And I go, it was a Friday. And I go, no. And he goes, why are you dressed like it? That particular day, I knew I was giving a big presentation. And so instead of wearing the typical white shirt, I wore a white shirt that had fake red stripes as kind of an expression of my individuality. I still had the blue suit, the wingtips. Turns out that individuality was not appreciated. And he made that clear. And so from that day forward, you didn't see me in a white shirt with red stripes. From that day onward, it was the white shirt. I was not trying to impress upon anybody that I was going to the circus that day. But it was quite an interesting and unusual place.
Yeah, I'm curious about the company culture. How was IBM back then?
Very rigid and process oriented, that it was more about the process than it was individuals, which I liked. And the training was phenomenal. The training I got in terms of management school, middle management school, executive training school, you were really taught the right way to do things. Much like from what I've been told, GE's manufacturing management program is, that IBM, I think, ran something very similar. And I'm very, very fortunate to have been a part of that. And it's something I'll always cherish and value.
Mm-hmm. So IBM was already an industry leader, no doubt back then, and also an international player, right? They have, different branches in different areas. You mentioned a few foreign country that you worked for when you were IBM. How did that international experience influence you, if any way?
Hugely important in terms of what I would eventually do. That what most people don't understand, there's such cultural differences in the way people do business in one geography versus another, what's important, what's not important. And some very distinct examples would be Korea and Japan, which of course I used extensively later in my career at Apple, because I was making a dozen international trips a year. I was going to those places, meeting with those suppliers, working out deals with them. And I feel like I really did know what it was like to walk a mile in their shoes. I knew what their days looked like on their home turf. And probably most of my colleagues didn't have the advantage of knowing that. And so I thought it was always tremendously helpful. And I developed a really a strong set of principles of respect for those people for that reason. And similarly, Scottish is now not, the Scots are not known as a hotbed of technology, but their business principles were equally very strong, very good. I've got a huge amount of respect for how they do things, and I learned a lot.
What a strategy or advice would you give to people if they enter into a new culture?
Well, this is somewhat a generic that could be applied to both this question and a broader one. Is what helps me in negotiations is not to get so myopic about what I need and what I want, and to approach the negotiation that way, that if I've done all my homework, that's just a given. But I think about, how will the proposals I'm going to make be received by the other side? I try to practice empathy, and in their position, does what I'm saying make sense or doesn't make sense? Where are their strong points, their weak points? And so I've always tried to be a very empathetic negotiator in putting things in a position that would be most attractive to the other side. And a term I sometimes use in negotiations is verbal jujitsu, that to take a person's own words and their own phrases and turn it around slightly and repeat it to them and get them agreeing that this is your idea, right? And so that's been a very effective tool to bringing people to a consensus to your final objective, while they're feeling as they got what they want, and hopefully they did. Sometimes there is a win-win, and I love that when that happens. Sometimes, quite honestly, and a lot of people don't want to hear this, sometimes the pie is only so big and there's a win-loss. When it comes down to something like price, the price is higher or lower. And so depending on your perspective, it's a win-loss. And if there is a win-loss, I intend to get the win. I don't leave that on the table.
Very interesting, because you were educated as an engineer, right? And then you entered into the workforce, and you start leading, I think procurement, one thing you do all the time is negotiating. I mean, I could only imagine IBM back then has huge negotiation power, right? Being the leader in the industry. So why do you think it's important in an empathetic way to negotiate?
Well, I think the easiest way to negotiate is to come from a position of extreme power where you can dictate terms. And occasionally that's the case, and once in a while it can be used. But I think you have to be very selective about such an approach, because it'll leave a bad taste in the mouth of others. And that's probably not going to be your last interaction with them, that you want to leave things set up good for the next time. And there have been, some somewhat infamous companies that when they were riding high, they treated their suppliers very, very poorly because they could. And then later that became their downfall. In fact, there's been a few things written about me, and many of them were false, and some of them just really seethed about. And some of the things written were that I was Attila the Hun, in effect in negotiations. That was never the case. I was always more thoughtful about how you set things up for next time, how the other party would feel good about the outcome. And I was very careful for that to happen. And you read things on the internet of people who don't even know. I've stopped reading those things, by the way. As a general principle in negotiation, what I've tried to impress upon people is I use a lot of analogies. Some of them people get, some don't, lots of sports analogies. And again, for people who don't play sports, I'm probably a little bit difficult to follow, but I think of negotiation in the sense of playing a round of golf. You've got many clubs in the bag. You use the club that is best suited for that particular shot. Sometimes the driver, sometimes an iron, sometimes the putter. But I tend not to go into situations saying, I'm going to use this club. I look at the environment and I try to choose which tool in the tool bag is best for this particular circumstance. And I think about with more experience, you get better at knowing which tool to choose. And also you get better at refining each one of those tools so you feel comfortable with using that tool when it becomes necessary. And I always thought of it that way. I have a tool bag. I need to know enough about every tool that I can use each one with a great deal of confidence. And I have enough experience to know which one to use in a particular circumstance.
Do you want to give us a few examples of the tools that in your tool bag?
Well, as an example, in negotiation, what I've witnessed, I've seen people unwittingly use what I consider to be substandard behavior to get to a good outcome. And it's amazed me to a degree. And one of those being anger and emotion. And so I've watched that unfold in negotiations. No one is more calm or non-emotive than I am because I'm always thinking of the next move. But as you and others may have seen in a meeting, I might come across as very angry and shout and yell only because I've learned that's a tool that perhaps will get you to the outcome in that circumstance, but only if you're controlling it. If you're truly that angry, I think you might do something dumb. But I've seen circumstances of where you can yell and shout and impress upon the other side that it's time for them to concede, and it works. That's just one example, and I've seen many other tactics work. And so I've tried to adapt to each circumstance. In fact, I can recall once in a meeting, I actually took my shoe off and flung it across the table and hit the wall on the other side. And they called a short break and they came back in and said, we'd like to agree to what you asked for, that we don't want to make you any more angry than you already are. Not that you do that in every meeting, obviously, or I ever did it again, but that's an example of having tools in your toolkit and knowing when to use them.
I fondly recall some of the negotiation that I joined, I participated with you together. I think one lesson that I learned was silence is gold. Sometimes I'm eager to convince the other party this is a good idea to pursue, but sometimes you really just wanted to give them a moment of silence, have people thinking through it. And you did this very well, at least in that particular negotiation. I was with you together.
I couldn't agree more that silence is one of your most powerful tools. That and a concerned look, that if you just stare someone directly in the eye with a very concerned look, sometimes their imagination runs wild on what you're thinking, and they'll migrate to whatever might be the worst possible outcome for themselves because they don't know. That's human nature, and that's what they assume. So without ever saying a word, you moved them to exactly where you wanted them. But it's hard for people to do. Some people have difficulty with silence. I don't.
Yeah. Were you happy after you done a good negotiation? Do you celebrate?
It's a great question. In my mind, I always replay the negotiation in my head and I wonder if it could have been done better. And I critique myself probably harder than anybody else does. But sometimes, you go to Asia, you do a huge negotiation, you get on the plane, and my worst nightmare has always been the other side is out at an expensive club, having expensive cigars, drinking expensive bourbon, saying, boy, did we get Blevins on that one, that he came unprepared or he wasn't determined or passionate enough. And so he left something on the table and now we're smoking cigars and drinking bourbon and we just love him. That would just keep me awake at night because I'd always want to think I got the absolute best deal possible. So they were okay with it, but they weren't out having a celebration at my expense. And so for that reason, I would generally never celebrate too much. Sometimes I would actually feel good about things, but I was always thinking about the next one. You're only as good as the next one. But I tended to critique what went well, what didn't go well, and think about that for next time as opposed to too much celebration.
Yeah. People say, there's a phrase say like life is negotiation, right? Do
It
you
is.
feel that way? Do you
I
feel
do.
that way? Yeah, both like professional and personal, or
Absolutely. I
yeah.
absolutely feel that way. That how we interact with human beings is communication, and communication to me is by nature negotiation. You know, whether you're the significant other and you're trying to make sure that they feel good about things, that's somewhat of a negotiation. I think virtually anything we do in life is a negotiation. It doesn't have to be about dollars or anything else, but it's somewhat of a negotiation to get to a common place where both parties feel good about things.
Do you have a definition for negotiation? What is negotiation exactly means to you?
I guess in my view, a negotiation is getting to the best possible agreement on something in broadest terms of whether that's buying something, getting the right price or terms, or negotiating where you're going to go to dinner, or it could be anything, but it's using skills, communication, listening to work with someone else to get to the best possible outcome.
What about deal maker? I mean, do you think they're the same thing or different?
I think they're somewhat different. I think all of us negotiate all the time, whether we know it or not. We have different levels of skills. I think of deal makers is creative people with a great deal of business acumen who can architect something of things can be done this way and this will be moved here. That's the way I think of big deals. And some of the things, and negotiation is part of deal making, but it's not all of it. There are times I would sketch out on a piece of paper, here's how things will work. And it might involve multiple companies, multiple divisions. And there's a concept or a kernel of an idea that could be really, really good. To me, that's a deal maker. And then you have to negotiate that. And an example would be at my previous employer, oftentimes we would use prepays that we would say we're going to prepay from materials and there'd be a set of terms associated with that, that was the deal making part. And then bringing the other side to agreement on that would be the negotiation part. And you needed both.
So tell us a little bit about your reputation, and as a negotiator, people call you Blevinator at Apple. How did that come up, as a terminology? I only heard a Terminator before, so Blevinator is, what does that mean?
I saw it in the press for the first time. I didn't know anybody called me that. If they did, no one addressed me that way. And I wasn't certain if it was good, bad, or indifferent. So it was just as much a mystery to me as it was anyone else. And then I asked some people about it, and they said, well, yeah, we call you that because you're relentless. You'll stop at nothing. So I think that was what was meant by it. I thought, okay, well, if that's the case, I'll take it neither as a compliment or an insult, because that's kind of true. I stop at nothing. And so if that's how the term is being used, I can't object. And of course, I couldn't object anyway. But I think that's probably how it was used. But I never called myself that, obviously. And the first time I saw it, it was very much a mystery.
When did you join Apple? How did
Uh,
that happen?
well, that's an interesting story. This is a peculiar story. I'll be willing to bet to most of your listeners who don't have as much gray hair as I do. But if you rewind back to the summer of 2000, I was at IBM. I was on their executive track. I was very happy. I was living in North Carolina. I was going to North Carolina state football games. Few people in life were happier than I have to say. I get a call to interview at Apple, and I politely declined. I don't want to work for Apple. I don't want to live in California. And the other side was very persistent, and they go, I tell you what, how about just taking a free weekend trip out to San Francisco? How bad could that be? Stop in and have a quick discussion on Friday afternoon, enjoy the weekend in San Francisco. And at first I resisted, and then I acquiesced. And so I went out, and when I toured Apple's campus, it was so different than IBM that back in that day, people, and still to this day to a degree, people were wearing shorts. It was like a college campus environment. People were very passionate about what they were working on, the products. And to me, it had similarities to how my father ran his business. And just a chord struck with me. I said, maybe this is the right place for me. And so nowadays, when people join Apple, they're joining the largest corporation in the world, one of the most respected, and it's a pretty easy decision. At the time I made that decision, things were a little different. That I actually took a decrease in compensation to go, a significantly higher cost of living to go. In fact, I'll never forget the movers who moved me from my house in Raleigh to California. And they moved me in, they go, "Sir, we just wanted to tell you that we're sorry. You seem like a really nice guy, and we're not sure what happened to you in your life, but we moved you from house A to B, and we can't help but." And I go, "Well, if it's any consolation to you, I paid 50% more for the house in California." And they're like, "My God." It was a pretty big risk. And I'll never forget, again, this story will be peculiar to a lot of people. In 2000, when I informed the vice president at IBM I was leaving for Apple, he goes, "This is undoubtedly the stupidest decision you'll ever make in your life." And he goes, "You know, they're going to go out of business. It's just a matter of time." And a lot of people don't realize back at that period of time, the market cap of Apple was about 5% IBM, a little bit less. So IBM was 20 times larger, and IBM was around 150 billion. Apple had gone down to as low as 6. Then you fast forward 18, 20 years later, IBM is still about $150 billion market cap company. Apple is 3 trillion. And so the lesson I learned from that is Apple probably should have hired me sooner. So I don't know if it was a coincidence or not, but the company did pretty well. And it wound up not being the stupidest decision I'd ever made in my life. And it was just a tremendous amount of fun too. You know, I went to a company that was the scrappy underdog and was so much smaller than IBM. You had to be really clever to negotiate something to, over time, became medium sized, then large, and then before you know it, mammoth. So it's quite an experience.
Yeah, the starting point, how you joined Apple was interesting to me because you're wired as a great negotiator to begin with, right? So when you look at the pay, the cost of living, like the preparation, the engineer mind of the analytic piece of it probably didn't work. So what exactly attracted you there and made you feel like you could make that decision?
It was a couple of things. Number one is, and first and foremost, I was excited about the possibility of doing something great. That I liked the fact that everybody at Apple was thinking about the customer and how the customers would use the product, very consumer oriented. And so to me, that made it exciting and fun to get up every day. Because I have to say, by that point at IBM, and no disrespect to them, but it was such a large monolithic corporation that they would release a product with some set of numbers and consonants. There was no excitement among consumers or the people who worked on them. That quite honestly, nobody cared, is the way it felt. You know, something would get built and things get shipped out, but there just wasn't a great deal of care, to be quite honest. And on top of that, employees had almost zero equity stake. Even up to the CPO had a fraction of stock options were just becoming known in IBM, where at Apple, a large set of the company were incented if the company succeeds, and so do you. And so there was something about that. I really liked having skin in the game, that I felt like I could actually turn some dials and knobs. And if things were to be successful, then I would enjoy that success. But I knew I was taking a risk that, my near-term standard of living would go down significantly, and it did.
Was Steve Jobs back to the company that
Yes.
time? Yeah.
Mhm.
Did he have any impact to your decision or?
Yes. I mean, knowing you had, such a leader at the top, I would have never taken that leap otherwise. But Steve had come back maybe 18 months, 2 years earlier. The first iMac had already been introduced. And so there were signs that Apple might climb back from the dead. But most people didn't realize it, because it was after that Michael Dell famously said Apple would be better off just shutting the doors and giving what's left back to shareholders, because they've got zero chance.
So how long were you at Apple?
I was there for about 22 years, I think.
22 years. Wow. That's a long time. So you experienced at Apple, a 6 billion-ish market cap all the way to 3 trillion. That's just what a ride.
And it's a fast-paced environment, as most people know. In fact, they measure Apple years and dog years, where it's a 7-to-1 ratio. So some people would argue that 22 at Apple is equivalent to almost 150 any other place, because things do move fast.
Yeah. So what achievement or moments at Apple are you most proud of?
I would say my most proud moments there were when a new product would be released, and I'd be a part of the people in the front of the employee seating, and we would announce what the product was, and people would just go crazy. It was a rock star environment, and to be a part of releasing those kinds of products gave you a sense of fulfillment, whether that be an iPod, which was thrilling. That was my first. To later, the iPhone was phenomenal. MacBooks, AirPods. There's this AirPads, a succession of products of where it felt like the world was being wowed and people were in awe. And then I would travel the world, the most far reaches of China, Korea, you name it, and I would see people using and enjoying Apple products, knowing that you were a part of that. You worked on those products and you were integral to those things happening. There's a certain sense of satisfaction that's just, it's difficult to explain, because few companies and products have the kind of brand loyalty that Apple does. That maybe Harley Davidson. It's tough to find examples of where people are so passionate about the brand. And so when you work for a brand like that, you can't help but feel proud.
Was there a particular new product release moment that kind of on top of your list?
Looking back in retrospect, it would have to be the iPhone. For the longest time, I thought it was the iPod, which arguably without the iPod, the iPhone may or may not have happened. But the iPhone, I'll never forget, that day it was announced as being, 3 devices, an internet navigator, basically a computer in your hand, that the crowd, after it was announced, started to think about the possibilities of what that device might do. And so again, many members that are listening in today probably don't remember back during the days that if you wanted to drive someplace, you get on the computer, you go on to probably Yahoo Maps at the time, you would print out instruction, you print out reverse instruction because it might be different. You'd fold them up, you get in the car, versus having a device in your hand that would reset automatically if you made an error, that if you didn't make a reservation someplace before you left, and there were just so many things in life that were completely different. It's changed life as we know it, the smartphone. And without Apple, who knows if the smartphone would be here even today? Maybe not in the same form, but you have to think back to being a part of that. It's quite incredible.
Mm-hmm. So within your 22 years journey with Apple, is there a most memorable stories that you could share with us?
I'll take away with me so many stories, just highly entertaining personal stories. The people I worked with were the absolute best. There were really some characters in the pioneering days, because that was back when the company's motto was, the misfits were the different ones, the ones that will change the world, or the ones crazy enough to know that's not possible, sort of things. But yeah, I'll take away some really fantastic memories from that. My friends have begged me to write a book, so I don't know. We'll see.
Another area that I would like to explore with you is, within Apple, or maybe a lot of other tech company as well, company leadership trying to strike a balance, right, between engineering, creativity, innovation versus, an operation, cost-driven and scale. So this healthy kind of relationship between engineering and operation, I sometimes thinking about that's a dance, between, it's an elegant dance between engineering and operation. How do you manage that?
I personally think that was probably my former employer's best or most significant strength, is how that got managed, that delicate dance, as you called it. And I think the way they were so successful is that they never wanted to limit the creativity of the engineering team, that there could be ops input into a situation. There would be on what was pragmatic from a cost perspective or possible from a logistics perspective. That input was always there, but the company, without exception, would then step back and say, what is best for consumers? Forget what the operations want or necessarily engineering, but what's the most creative product? What's the best product consumers can have, and we're going to go with that answer. And then the burden would fall onto operations to make it happen. And that organization had the attitude that the impossible is our normal. Please give us the impossible. That's what we specialize in. And so instead of complaining, the team just had a get it done attitude. And so if you think about the flexibility of Apple's supply chain, it's quite amazing when we consider they were using custom components versus standard. They were generally using fewer sources than competitors. There was all these limitations that were put on them in order to get to the best design, but somehow they made it happen. And I think it was a tribute to the talent and the creativity of that organization and the approach that if, I were running or starting my own company today, that's exactly how I would do it. And I think it's hard for large corporations to find that niche and stick with it.
So when you joined Apple, what was your position? Describe that situation. I mean, in contrast, I guess after 22 years, like what was your position and your area of responsibility?
It's very interesting. I got very excited after that first visit, and I thought, wow, this is something I really want to do. And I was offered a job with somewhat disappointing compensation. And my question was, well, what exactly will I be doing? And the answer was, well, we'll figure it out when you get here. And so, and that's kind of what happened. And Apple's very confidential. And so as it turns out, my belief is what I was brought in to do was operations for the iPod, because that's what I quickly did. But to begin with, I wasn't even disclosed on the project. It hadn't actually gotten started. And so I did corporate procurement, which is something I'd never done before. And so, corporate procurement essentially means buying those things you need to run the business that you don't resell. Everything from, toilet paper to desk chairs. It's things you have to buy, but you don't resell them to others. And so that was quite a new experience for me. I'd never done that before, but I just relied on being willing to learn, adapting to circumstances, trying to bring some creative ideas. And so I did that as I geared up to begin working on the iPod, and was fortunate enough to be able to build that supply chain from absolute ground zero. And that was done a little bit different than Apple's Mac supply chain. And so something I'll never forget. It was a great deal of fun, and building a team from scratch. It was just me. There was one, and I quickly learned if we're going to bring this thing to market, probably need someone more than just me.
Wow. So fast forward to like 22 years later, all those years that you clearly built a fantastic career at Apple.
I couldn't be more proud of the team. And I think if I could say I contributed anything to Apple, it would be the legacy of the team. That bear in mind, when I first came to Apple in 2000, because the company was on the verge of bankruptcy, it wasn't the destination place for anyone to work, that I started by trying to have one-on-ones with some of the individuals in the organization to find out exactly what they did. And it was F troop. And for those who are not aware of that term, that's the absolute worst. That coming from a very disciplined place like IBM with very talented people, it was utterly F troop is what I inherited. There were days I just put my head in my hands. I go, my God, what have I gotten myself into? And to give you an example of why I felt that way, there was one individual I continuously tried to set up a one-on-one meeting for the first couple of weeks to find out exactly what it was he did. And it took several weeks. He finally comes in, and this is, we tried his cell phone, we tried his pager, and he goes, understand that you're trying to get in touch with me. What can I do for you? I go, well, yeah, I've been trying to get in touch with you for a month, and there's nobody at your cubicle. And he goes, oh, I work from home. And I go, that's odd. Just out of curiosity, who authorized that? And he gave me a name. And I go, you do work in procurement, right? He goes, yeah, I work in procurement. I'm like, I don't even know who that is. And so then I have to go ask somebody, you ever heard of this name? That was the predecessor to my predecessor, who hadn't been there in 2 years. And he said, that's the person who authorized. So the person who I replaced went 2 years without even knowing he had someone on the payroll that he was paying that never came to work and never answered. He was just, I'm like, do you have a good reason why? I mean, out of the entire team, not one of the 33 survived the first 18 months. So we turned that over. That wasn't the best organization I've ever seen. I'll just leave it at that. But you fast forward to 22 years later, we had an organization of about 1,300 individuals, probably approximately 70% degreed engineers, probably 30% with master's degrees or better from the most prestigious universities. Because at that point, we could recruit from anywhere. We brought from Harvard, MIT, the best of the best were available to us to recruit from. And then harkening back on my IBM days, I tried to put in place really good discipline training programs, but we could just recruit, in my opinion, the best of the best. We motivated them. We gave them the ability to succeed and do well. And in my personal opinion, that organization was and is just hitting it out of the park. And I couldn't be more proud than that. That it was quite a metamorphosis over time, the degree of skill and contribution of what those people were capable of. And I think they're going to continue doing it. They'll continue doing it long after I'm gone.
Apple is very fast paced and high pressure, I would say, and as well as being very innovative, come up with revolutionary product. Everybody works very hard. But I'm wondering, how do you balance the innovation with the demand of day-to-day operation?
Well, that is a tough one. And I think the reason it's tough is because Apple at its core, and I think any successful consumer electronics company has to be very creative, has to think outside the box, has to do things differently. Conversely, any really great operations team has to be process driven, process oriented. So the same thing gets done every single time, every single day, and so it's the left brain, right brain thing. And so bringing those two things together is quite a trick. And I personally think Apple's probably done it better than anybody else, which I think is, if it's not the major secret to their success, it's certainly one of them. And so seeing that in action has been quite fulfilling, but that's the trick. It's the sort of thing that's much easier said than done.
Do you think is that sort of task a different group of people do different things? Or do you think it's better like everybody's doing the same, try to balance between strategic versus execution versus operation versus innovation,
I think it's circumstantial. That what I've learned is some people are phenomenal strategic thinkers and some are phenomenal at daily operations. There's a very small subset that can do both. There are people, and so when and if that's the case, I think you're better off at letting people gravitate toward their natural affinity. And so I think Apple's done a really good job at doing that. However, I would couch that by saying one of the things I learned early on in my career is that I managed a joint engineering procurement team back at IBM in Scotland. And what I noticed, it was a constant struggle between the two teams, that the engineers would want to do one thing, and undoubtedly the procurement team hated that because it had cost or supply chain implications. And all they did was squabble with one another from my perspective. And I was having to solve every minor squabble. And it's because I wanted to optimize both. And it appeared to me that the objectives were written such that their objectives were in conflict. And so I rewrote all of them, much to the chagrin and dismay of the people involved, that everybody had the same metrics as I did, that you're responsible for everything. And so all of a sudden, the engineers were also responsible for the cost of the project. And they go, but I'm not negotiating the cost. I'm like, no, but what you design has a major impact. And the procurement team would be responsible for product performance. They go, I didn't design it. I'm like, yes, but to the degree you select or force substandard suppliers or take shortcuts in a negotiation on specs, you're in. And so in that regard, I'm a big fan of having everybody do everything. That I think it's better. But your specific question about ops, strategic versus operational, over time, I came to think there's some people, they're just too good at one or the other. It doesn't make sense to take a square and try to pound it through a round hole, or vice versa. They're just different.
So do you think some of those challenges you describe, I suppose it's an ongoing, it's commonly seen, from a large corporation. Do you think AI could solve some of those problems?
No.
No?
I don't. I think there's a great many things AI can do. I don't think that's one of them. It also comes down to the grand organizational question is, do you have smaller focused business groups or where you're self-contained every function, or do you have one monolithic engineering organization, monolithic ops? I think it depends. It ebbs and flows over time and it's circumstantial. But I think you have to be very flexible, and just changing things up itself can sometimes be beneficial.
Mm. I'm curious about a couple questions. One is, do you think the best procurement or supply chain professional, will specialists do well or will generalists do well?
It's interesting you mentioned that, but I tend to think specialists who are intellectually curious and are willing to learn and adapt will be best. That a couple things I've learned within procurement, having done a lot of different jobs, if you take someone who is, for example, managed four or more commodities, for example, they've done displays, they've done batteries, and they become experts in that, they are much better suited and adapted to doing something that's completely new to them than someone who may have been a specialist in only one of those categories for 20 years. They've never been put in the situation of, I'm learning and adapting into it. It's almost like you learn to learn. Um, that's one thing. And so for that reason, I think it's very helpful to have those multiple areas of expertise. And then secondly, something I was very fortunate to have been able to do at IBM. I was put in a number of different roles, as I mentioned before, from cost accounting to engineering to procurement, that if you know what it's like being in those functions, you can be a better partner to that organization. You can be more understanding, more empathetic, and ultimately more effective in your own role than if you'd been in that singular role for 20 years. And everything in front of you is very commonplace, but you may not know or care what happens in those other organizations. If you've walked a mile in their shoes, you better understand. You can be a better teammate, my opinion.
Mm-hmm. So if you are still in one of those senior leader executive position in a corporation like Apple or Google or similar organization, IBM, would you invest more in AI or would you invest more in people?
That is a great question. In the near term, I would invest more in people, but over time, I think the opposite is going to take place. That an investment done today, I would invest in people, but I think AI is going to mature, it's going to develop very quickly, and you don't necessarily have to be on the bleeding edge of that curve. I think there'll be a lot of learning that others do in a very painful way that then you jump to and gravitate and integrate as quickly as you possibly can, as opposed to you doing all the investment and going through all the learning pains. And then once you solve it, others will replicate what you've done. I think it's going to be eventually AI, but if it were me spending the dollars, it would be people today and AI in the very near future.
Mm-hmm. What are the things that cannot be replaced by AI?
Well, I mean, conceivably, the way AI is constructed, almost anything could be. Almost anything could be. It depends on how the rules are constructed and how sophisticated it gets. I think there may be no limitations. It's almost frightening, but because some people will say, well, there's certain aspects of the human brain that can't be replicated. I disagree. I think that you can program in a certain set of parameters and you can replicate what happens just at a much broader scale, much more rapid scale. Now that's going to be decades in the making in all likelihood, but I think it's just limitless. In fact, I recently did a speech to the NC legislature on this and investment. So I'm a huge fan, and I think it's going to be huge, and you want to be on the curve sooner than later. But pragmatically, today, if I were forced to choose between human horsepower and AI, I'd best human horsepower.
What about negotiation? What about a Blevinator?
I've never thought about that before, but I'm going to investigate it more after this discussion, because it would be fascinating to me to feed in parameters and let one computer negotiate with another.
Yeah.
No idea what the outcome might be.
It'd be interesting, right? And the super powered AI negotiator negotiate with each other. I don't know how to think
Almost
about
like,
that.
a human being playing chess against, Deep Blue. In my
Yeah.
case, it'd be hard for me to program in how I negotiate, because so much of it is reflexive and I invent right on the spot that I've never thought of before. It's just something, the snaps, boom, and and that could be the breakthrough. And it wasn't part of my preparation or plan. It just came to me. It reminds me, again, sports analogies, apologies. There was a somewhat famous basketball coach, Abe Blevins, I think at Texas Tech, who had a philosophy. He was going to play, I think, Bobby Knight. And they said, well, how do you approach his team with their very disciplined approach? And he looked at him and said, I don't want tricky plays. I want tricky players. Heck, even I don't know what those SOBs are going to do. So how's the other team going to architect something to stop us? Even I don't know. And so that was meant to be funny, but there's a little bit of truth to that. That if your basis is tricky players versus tricky plays, who knows what they're going to do?
Yeah.
And so a computer would have a tricky play. How does that compare to a tricky player? It's hard to say.
That's right. I think time will tell.
It will. It's going to be fascinating, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. So you clearly absolutely have a fantastic, years at Apple, 22 years.
I did.
Yeah.
I'm very fortunate.
Yeah. All right. So we're going to pivot to August 2022, about 2 years ago. So could you tell us what happened?
I guess today's the 23rd. So it's been, 2 years and 1 day. Wow, it seems like decades ago. So much has changed since then. And so I guess to make a long story short, one of my many passions were automobiles, classic cars. And so every year I take as much of the week off as possible when I was at Apple, which generally used to be 1 or 2 days. That's the biggest part of 1 week that was possible. Now I take all week off. I just came back from a week there. So that's kind of nice. But I tell people it's not car week to me, it's Holy Week. It's almost like a religious holiday to me that I go to all these different car shows. I meet people I haven't seen, all year. And it's Christmas, 4th of July, Halloween, Labor Day, Easter, all rolled in to one for me. And so I really look forward to it. And so I was attending a car show called the Quail, which is arguably, one of the best ones. A lot of people, including me, think it's better than Pebble Beach. And so I was coming into the parking lot in my civilian car, having a car already in the show. And as I come in to park, a young goofy kid comes running up to me, and he said something along the lines of, nice car, what do you do? And there's a little bit of background that the answer I gave to him was a standard phrase I probably used hundreds and hundreds of times. So that didn't come out of nowhere. And again, none of this has been written about because nobody really asked me my side of the story, if there is a side. And so the passenger I consulted with very quickly is, can I give them my normal phrase? Because when people ask me what I do, the last thing I would ever say is Apple. Everything was very secretive, very confidential. When people say, hey, it's a nice house, what do you do? Or it's a nice, what do you do? I would give them a joke, which came from, I would say it's a PG-13 joke. And I would say that with some degree of confidence because I actually plagiarized it from a PG-13 movie, Arthur. And it was rated PG-13. And in fact, that particular line is on the trailer of the movie. And so I consulted my passenger. Is that okay? Are you going to be offended? No, go ahead and say it. And so I said it, and he laughed. We all had a good laugh. It lasted 20 seconds, and I go into the car show and I go about my business. And then I find out later that it had caused uproar within Apple, that people were so offended and outraged by that comment. And online, people said, well, how could he be so stupid to say something like that and think it's not going to blow up in his face? There's a little bit of background. Number one, as I progressed through my career at Apple and I got promotions, no one ever told me that in exchange for that, I was forever forsaking the ability to tell jokes. That kid back in high school would never have made that deal. I've been telling jokes and pulling pranks on people my whole life, and no one ever told me that right was revoked from me. And then secondly, the kid that asked me the question, I thought it was the three of us. That it turns out he had someone filming this out of my view without my consent or knowledge, filmed it and then placed it on TikTok. And interestingly enough, when I was informed this was on TikTok, I go, I've never been on TikTok. I don't even know how to access it. maybe it's, a bit of an old school guy, because people said, why did you post that on TikTok? I'm like, I most certainly didn't. I don't even know how to get on and see it myself. So there was, that was part of the circumstance that, it's one of those things, it pops up, it happens. I knew not to say Apple. I just told a joke instead. Hindsight being 2020, I could have told him to screw off, to leave me alone. I could have said something rude. I could have ignored him, but that's not me. That I think about it, if that had happened 1,000 times, I'd have probably done it the same thing. I would have told a flippant joke and laughed and moved on, which is exactly what I did. And so one of those things, that it is what it is. At the conclusion, I said, look, to anyone that I truly offended by my clumsy attempt at humor, I do truly apologize. I never intended to offend anyone by that. It was just a joke.
Thanks for sharing your side of the story. How did the 20-something second TikTok video change your life?
Well, it's somewhat interesting to me that, what I was told is based on Apple's moral and ethical standards, that was out of bounds. And so I should immediately resign, which I found curious with respect to perspectives. One is the line itself was lifted from a movie sold on Apple TV Plus to this day for $3.99. So if you pay $3.99 to see it, it's not offensive. Or if you look at the trailer, and again, it is PG-13. And the second thing is, if we're trying to make a moral, ethical statement, why is the first thing you want me to do lie and say that I'm resigning when I have no intention of resigning? I like what I'm doing. I like my career. And so I said, I'm not going to do that. That's a lie. And so, I was summarily dismissed after that. But it is one of those things. And the thing I find curious, and I thought about later, is that it's, maybe it's not up to Apple's moral or ethical standards. Corporations, especially for-profit corporations, have no moral, ethical standards. Apple nor any other corporation has a moral or ethical. It's an inanimate object. They have people, and they do what's known as, moral or ethical signaling. Anything they can signal to the market that helps the profits of the corporation, they do and should do and will do, because by definition, they're here to make profit. So if they can do signaling that helps profits, by all means, they should do that. But then adopting that as a standard and saying the enterprise itself has morals or ethics is simply ludicrous. It's an inanimate object. And so I found that quite interesting in retrospect.
Why did you pick that joke particularly?
It's the only one I could think of quickly. As a kid, I saw that movie and I just thought it was an entertaining line. And so I've been asked that many times. And that's when they say, what do you do for a living? And I'll kind of say that as a joke. I personally think it's funny. Again, that's probably my opinion. I'm one sample size in the world that thinks that. But the only other time that I was forced to, in a circumstance, say the word Apple at my stepdaughter's school, there was a function you had to stand up and announce, where you worked. And it was a very stiff, and that wasn't the environment. There was more than 3 people. So I didn't tell my joke. Remember when I told it, I thought it was 3 people. This was a group of probably 100 people. It occurred to me, probably not an appropriate thing to say, might offend somebody. And I said, I work at Apple. And so then several people came up to me and he said, oh, I go by the mall all the time. You work at the mall. And I went, nope. So that wasn't a particularly good experience. But everybody there said, oh, I'll be by the mall. Tell your dad, maybe I'll stop in and say hi. That must have happened 15 times. Everybody just assumed when I said, oh, you work at the mall.
So it's been 2 years. I'm curious about, the moment that you went through this 2 years ago versus like 2 years later. Was there any thoughts changed?
Well, yeah, there's been a lot of thought, as you can imagine. And so initially I was a bit shocked, and I'm sure I went through all the stages of grief, from disbelief to anger to frustration. But I processed that pretty quickly and moved on. I said, there's nothing really I can do about it now. All you can do is move on, which is what I've done. And I have to say, all of us in life, we have to make the best of our circumstances, and we have to accept the consequences of the decisions we made. And I've done that my whole life. I've made decisions that worked out great and some that didn't work out so great. but they were my decisions. And so I just have to accept it and move on. Most of the times they're not reversible. So you can't do that. In this particular case, I was quite fortunate that this may have been one of the more fortunate things that's ever happened to me, because there's a lot of people that express sympathy. I'm sorry that happened. I'm like, the thing about it is I've had the best 2 years of my life since. I was so deeply ingrained about what I did there, but I'd been doing it for 22 years. Now it's opened up a whole different world of possibilities to me from both personal and professional aspects. And to give you, two quick examples that, early on in my career, I was so dedicated toward it. I missed critical years of my children growing up. I missed birthdays, I missed events because I was traveling, I was working, I was trying to build a career. And then you fast forward the last 2 years, each of my children now have moved in with me in Florida. And so they're adults now, but I'm spending time with them. I'm helping them in their careers. And I'm proud to say, in the case of my daughter, we go for a walk first thing every morning at 6 a.m. and I hear what's going on in her life and her career. In some cases, I give her advice. In other cases, I go, just give me the computer and let me do this. And so she got some feedback from her CFO, for example, that she had the most insightful and creative input on business he's ever witnessed from someone of her age and experience, which I was quite proud of. As an example, so I'm helping my children. Then secondly, from a career perspective, I've had the opportunity to do so many things I just couldn't have done otherwise. For example, and I'm involved in several boards now. I don't want to go back to another corporate position, but I was offered a lot of corporate positions from major companies. More enthused about the possibility of bringing me on board or some combination, but I don't want to do that. But the boards, several of them are nonprofit, which are probably the most meaningful. For example, one is based in San Jose, and we provide scholarships to underrepresented minorities to do cybersecurity. And so we've gotten our first class through now. It's called NextGen Cyber Talent. And so seeing the look on their faces when they graduate, they're placed in a program, and $60,000 to $80,000 not only changes their life, it changes the life of their entire family. It changes the perspective their younger siblings have on life. That it's the most uplifting thing ever to put your time, effort, and energy into doing something great. I'm also giving back to my alma mater, North Carolina State, where I'm on the board, and I'm loving that work. I feel like I'm doing something excellent. And then there's also some for-profit opportunities of where they actually compensate me quite handsomely. So I'm not starving. I'm not on food stamps. So I seem to have weathered this storm okay. And from a personal perspective, I've found balance, and I've never been happier in my life. So things have kind of worked out.
I'm curious about your perspective, in your opinion. In corporate America, is there a boundary between life and work? Why and why not?
I think there should be. That over time, that's vanished, but I think there should be a boundary, and I think it's healthy. Because I think there's certain behaviors you should exhibit at work and in the workplace because you're representing the company. It is a for-profit enterprise, and I think all of your activities and actions should be directed toward the profits of that company, quite honestly. But we're human beings, so why can't on your personal time you can go blow off some steam, that you can go to concerts, watch movies, anything you want to do, and that doesn't have to be necessary in the best company's interest, as long as it's not detrimental, obviously. But I've always felt like there was kind of a work Tony and an off-duty Tony, that at work, as you and others know, I was relatively demanding. That I guess that term Blevinator didn't come out of nowhere. I expected people to deliver results, and I was pretty hard-nosed about it. And one of the phrases I would often use when people, said they were overworked or under too much pressure, that I would say, well, there actually is a reason why we compensate you, as opposed to charging you admission like they do at Disneyland to come in. That we recognize you don't want to pay admission and come in and do this like Disneyland, but you are getting compensated, so suck it up. And so I was that way at work, as many people know, but off duty, off work, I'm quite playful, jovial, I tell my jokes, I kind of do my thing. And to me, I think that's quite natural and normal. And I think it's healthy. That in my experience, people are actually better at their career and work if they have an outlet for blowing off some steam, versus people who get under such a pressure cooker environment and they're never off, that their brain is constantly on work and nothing else. I think they eventually snap. At least that's been my perspective. And I've told people, try to find a hobby. try to do something on the weekend, hiking, golf, whatever, and get your mind off work a bit because you'll be more productive when you come back in. That I can recall, back in my college days, you spend time studying, that you go out and do something active, lifting weights or playing basketball, and you come back refreshed and you get more productivity out of your study time at that point. I noticed it then and I notice it now. I think if there are different things that can be complementary, and it's dangerous when they get blended together into one thing.
If the TikTok incident had happened to one of your subordinates, how would you handle that?
It's interesting that you mentioned that because I won't go into detail on this, but one similar circumstance probably 6, 7 years ago where something was brought to my attention of where someone had made a comment on a United Airline flight that another employee picked up on and was offended. And so it was brought to my attention to resolve. And the way I looked at it, I said, what is best for the company? The first thing I looked into was what is the performance and what is the contribution of the person that made the comment? They were coming back from a trip from Asia. Were they productive on that trip? Did they do what they were supposed to do? That was the first thing, and that was positive. The second thing is, did the comment truly offend the other person to the degree that it created a workplace that would make them less productive or others less productive than they could be? Because again, I'm only thinking about the workplace, because if a comment's made and it inhibits workplace productivity, you deal with it one way than you do if a comment was made and another person just doesn't like it. Because many of us in today's society practice what I think Chris Rock calls selective outrage. Today, everybody's outraged over something. And so I looked at it from the perspective of what's best for the company. In that particular circumstance, I didn't feel it was best to fire the person. I felt what was best was to go to the person who had the complaint and ensure they understand we looked into it seriously with empathy. We only wanted to do what's best for the company. The fact that the two individuals didn't work closely together anyway, and there was an assurance that it would never be anything similar done again. And I made a statement to the entire organization without citing that example, just what the expectations are to make clear to everyone. So that's the way I handled it. And so in that particular circumstance, I feel like I did the right thing. The easiest thing would have been to say, well, if someone's offended, I want to make sure I don't go against what's common prevailing theory here. So I'll just fire them. I'll just axe them from the company. That would have been the easiest thing to do, in my opinion. But I looked at, well, what's honestly the best thing for the company? And that's how I tried to guide most of my decisions. What's the best thing for the company?
Do you think there is a generational perspective gap on this TikTok incident? If so, how does it manifest?
Well, there probably is, because at the time of that particular movie, which I think was early 80s, 83, something like that, it was considered funny in a PG-13 movie and people laugh. But I guess, perspectives change. So maybe people of my generation would laugh at it. Maybe people at, later generations would find a great deal of offense. And so it could be that. I try to be empathetic to those. I've always tried to practice empathy. And to the degree I actually did offend someone genuinely, I feel bad about that. That wasn't my intent. That I didn't want to go out of my way to offend people, especially people I don't even know. Why would I do that? But again, first of all, I thought it was a private comment. And two, I didn't realize it was offensive, as I guess some people would say that it is. Because it was void of cursing or anything like that or anything explicit.
Yeah, now look back. What life advice would you give your past self?
I think about that somewhat. I wouldn't change a thing. I really wouldn't. That all the decisions I made for a reason. I did the best I could at the time. It's difficult to be critical. Not all those decisions worked out well for me, clearly, but to bore you with another sports analogy, that I'll play golf with people and they'll come back with a score that's X. They'll say, I shot a 90 today, but if this, and this, I would have shot an 84. So I'm really going to think about myself as shooting an 84. That they look at all the things that could have gone better but they don't look at, I'm like, yes, but also you hit a ball off a tree that bounced into the fairway. You did a couple things that were outrageously lucky, and you only look at the unlucky thing. they balanced out to a 90. So next time you go out, it'll be a different set of circumstance. You'll probably come in about the same score. And so that's the way I think about it, that if I could live my life over, some of the decisions would be different in a better way. Some would probably be different in a worse way. And they probably all balance out to somewhere in the same spot. It's kind of the way, so I don't have any regrets. As long as, I do things the best I can, because people have asked me before, they're like, well, do you regret that day, August 22nd? And I go, I don't. I absolutely don't. And I'm sorry to be so flippant and unrepentive, but it kind of is who I am. I was asked a question, I gave a joke, didn't mean to offend anyone, had no idea anybody was filming it. He was going to be on TikTok, the Wall Street Journal. I had no idea that was going to happen. I'm just living 22 seconds of my life like I lived the rest. And it kind of happened, and I'm not necessarily ashamed of it. It was just a joke. In fact, it wasn't even a creative joke. I'd feel better if it was one I'd made up on my own, because I could, I am funny at some points in time. That one was completely plagiarized.
So I asked this next question to almost every speakers. There's no standard answer. I'm just curious about, your perspective. Think of your life as a house. Can you knock down the wall between the rooms and be the same person in each one? Why and why not?
I think so. I think fundamentally, at least in my sense, I am who I am. I'm comfortable in my own skin. I know I'm far from perfect, but I kind of, regardless what room I'm in, I'm Tony. For all the good, bad, and indifferent things associated with that, I'm the same person. And so you can put me in an environment in a church choir and I'll do the best I can, or you could put me in a rock concert and I'll do, but fundamentally, I'm still me. I'll adapt to the circumstances to the degree I can, or I think it's appropriate. But I don't think it fundamentally changes the inner me. And I know I'm imperfect, but fundamentally, I'm okay with myself. That's why when I make mistakes, I try to learn from them, but I try not to get down or depressed or beat myself up too badly. I'll go, well, this is an opportunity to learn, that I just learned something from this. And so I'll try to do better next time.
Tony, what do you want your legacy to be? And how do you hope to achieve that?
I've given that some thought, and I think my one chance at having a legacy will be my children, and their children, and that's all you leave behind. That I think about my father, and I hope that one day I can make him proud. And I think of my grandfather, and I would consider myself part of their legacy. And it comes down to my children more than anything else. And the last 2 years, I've gotten much more time to focus on that. And I'm just exceptionally proud of them and how they're progressing and doing. They're going to, become wonderful young people.
What life advice would you give both your generation and the younger generations?
I think the one constant is change. Things are changing so quickly, and I think that's going to accelerate further in the future. I think about the life that my grandfather would have lived and my father versus me, and how different it's going to be for my children and their children. Things are just, if you look at the continuum of time going back to Roman era, I think things have never changed as quickly as they're changing now due to the digital environment and various other things, and electronics and AI. Things are changing so quickly that we're really going to need to develop an ability to adapt. And that's something I need to work on, that I need to adapt more quickly. And it couldn't be any more apparent than in my dress. I still dress old school with old school haircuts. And so one of these days, I need to adapt. In fact, I was telling my son the other day, I'm like, I never imagined myself becoming a dirty old man, but here I am killing it. I dress like an old man, and
Well, as we started this conversation, life is like a book. And your inner narrative holds immense power. It shapes your reality, drives your actions, and guides your path through life. Reflecting on the pivotal moment in your journey takes both courage and honesty. Tony, we're deeply grateful for your openness in sharing your journey with us, and we wish you the best luck as you write your next chapter.
Well, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure spending this time with you, Helen. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Tony. And as we wrap up, I wanted to remind everyone of Oceanside Perspective's mission to ignite diverse perspective from authentic voices across generations. May this episode inspire you to think with curiosity, grow with reflection, and learn with an open mind. Thank you for supporting us, and until next time, take care.
Thanks for listening to Oceanside Chat. We hope you enjoyed this conversation. If you liked it, please share our podcast and stay tuned for more episodes. We'll see you later.